Tufts University is committed to providing a digital environment that's accessible to all, including people with disabilities. The Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy requires that all third-party information technology be reviewed to determine whether the product or service meets the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act and with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, including revised Section 508, which prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities, including students, employees of the university, and members of the larger university community, such as alumni and guests. This policy applies to information technology such as web and non-web-based applications and software, services and platforms, digital content authoring tools, instructional technologies, mobile applications, and transaction portals and kiosks. The Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy and accompanying procurement guidelines for accessibility seek to ensure a barrier-free digital environment. As part of the larger technology review process, the Accessibility Review is a process for vetting all software, both web-based and non-web-based, to ensure that it meets the requirements of the Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy. Specifically, the policy requires that all products meet Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, 2.1 A and AA success criteria, as documented in the form of an industry standard accessibility compliance report, commonly referred to as a VPAT, or Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. Tufts requires a VPAT version 2.0 or higher, because earlier versions of the VPAT predate the revised Section 508 provisions. A VPAT is a report that is prepared by the vendor to document the product's compliance with United States, European Union, and other international accessibility standards. It generally includes the product name and version, the date of review, contact information, the evaluation methods used to test the product, including manual and automated testing, and a list of applicable standards and guidelines. For each guideline, an indication of supports, partially supports, does not support, and not applicable is provided. For any instance of partially supports or does not support, the remarks and explanations column should provide details regarding the nonconformance. The VPAT may also include a section called Functional Performance Criteria, which documents the impact of noncompliance on specific populations. For example, the impact on people without vision or with limited vision or without color perception, the impact on people without hearing or with limited hearing, with limited speech or manipulation, or on people with limited language, cognitive, or learning abilities. If the product VPAT indicates that the product is not compliant, the Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy requires that the vendor provide a detailed product development roadmap with a reasonable time frame for reaching compliance. The VPAT is the preferred documentation for the accessibility review. However, Tufts will also accept a document known as a HECVAT. The HECVAT, or the Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Toolkit, is a tool created by EDUCAUSE that's used by institutions of higher education to evaluate information security and privacy and to assist in vendor risk assessment. Beginning with version 3.0, the HECVAT included a series of questions regarding accessibility conformance. The version 3.0 HECVAT includes a section on IT accessibility with questions including: has a third-party expert conducted an audit of the most recent version of your product? Do you have a documented process for verifying accessibility conformance? Have you adopted a technical or legal standard of conformance for the product in question? Can you provide a current detailed accessibility roadmap with delivery timelines? Do you expect your staff to maintain a current skill set in IT accessibility? If the vendor provides a HECVAT 3.0 or higher, we would be looking for answers to these questions that confirm the product's accessibility compliance and the vendor's commitment to responding to and addressing accessibility concerns promptly. The accessibility review is part of the larger technology review process that includes a thorough analysis of security, privacy, and accessibility. To begin the process, the requester should complete the Technology Project Summary Information Form, which provides information about the requesting unit, a description of the product or service under consideration, and the expected users, volume, and impact. The Security and Privacy Review requires additional documentation which is outside the scope of this discussion. The Accessibility Report on Compliance, or AROC form, should be completed by the vendor and asks specifically what type of documentation they can provide about the product, for example, a VPAT or a HECVAT 3.0 or higher. It asks if a product development roadmap can be made available in the event that the VPAT or HECVAT indicate that the product is not compliant. There's also an option for the vendor to provide documentation in a form other than a VPAT or HECVAT. The Technology Project Summary Form and completed AROC and supporting documentation should be submitted together. The review can't begin until all the documentation is received. The Digital Accessibility Specialist will review the documentation and determine whether the product meets the requirements of the Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy and make a recommendation. After reviewing the documentation, the Digital Accessibility Specialist can approve the request if sufficient documentation is provided to confirm compliance of the product or service, or if sufficient documentation is provided to confirm partial compliance and the vendor has provided a product development roadmap with a reasonable time frame for reaching compliance. The Digital Accessibility Specialist is unable to approve if the vendor lacks documentation regarding the accessibility of the product, or if the documentation provided by the vendor indicates that the product is not compliant or only partially compliant, and the vendor cannot provide a product development roadmap with a reasonable time frame for reaching compliance. In order to move forward with the purchase of a product that does not meet the requirements of the Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy, a policy exception must be obtained from the Office of the CIO. It should be noted that a policy exception is a risk management decision, and the Digital Accessibility Specialist is not authorized to grant exceptions. The Office of the CIO will consider policy exceptions if you can demonstrate that one of the following criteria apply. These exception criteria are in line with the requirements of revised Section 508. First, not technically possible. When full compliance with accessibility standards is not technically possible. For example, virtual or augmented reality media for which full compliance is not yet fully supported. Fundamental alteration, when bringing the content, product, or service into compliance would fundamentally alter the program or service. This usually applies to a specific aspect of the product. For example, the listening comprehension exam portion of an online language course doesn't offer captions, as the captions would fundamentally alter the nature of the exam. Not commercially available or best meets. If you can demonstrate that you've been unable to find a more accessible alternative and that this is the most accessible option that meets the business need. For example, while there are many 3D modeling products available, none are fully compliant. So you have selected the product that offers the most support for students with disabilities while also meeting the curricular need. Finally, undue burden, when providing an accessible digital product or service, would result in an undue financial or administrative burden. Requirements for demonstrating undue burden are taken within the context of the resources of the university as a whole, making this criterion extremely difficult to meet. If the product you're requesting has not been approved under the Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy, the Digital Accessibility Specialist will advise you regarding the exception process at that time. Frequently asked questions. We've had this product for years. Do I still have to go through the accessibility review when I renew it? Yes, the Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy was implemented in 2019, so there are many products that are due for renewal that have not yet been reviewed for accessibility. This product is only used by a few people. Do I have to have an accessibility review? Yes, the policy applies to all purchases regardless of the number of users. The only exception is for single instance software or software purchased for an individual, like personal productivity tools, that's not required for anyone other than the requester. This product isn't intended for students or the public. Do I still need an accessibility review? Yes, the ADA and related federal mandates protect employees as well as students, alumni, and guests. The vendor doesn't have a VPAT or HECVAT, but they have an accessibility statement on their webpage. Is that sufficient? No. While we applaud the vendor's public statement regarding their commitment to accessibility, Tufts digital accessibility policy still requires documentation of a product's accessibility compliance in the form of a VPAT or a HECVAT. I hope this answers your questions about the digital accessibility review process. To learn more, check out one of the digital accessibility sessions in the Tufts Learning Center.